Welcome to OLLI's Authors Out Loud, a series of discussions with authors exploring their books, delving into the inspirations for their characters, themes, and stories, as well as discussing the craft of writing itself, the trials and victories authors experience seeing their work to completion. I am Susan Supak with my co-host, Jean Greenlaw. Today, we're speaking with Nicholas Kristof. Nick's life has evolved from his beginnings as an intrepid young man in the small town of Yamhill, Oregon, to the heights of respect with a reputation as one of journalism's greats. A two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, he was the youngest person ever to become a foreign correspondent for the New York Times. Nick's first Pulitzer Prize was awarded to him and his wife, Sheryl WuDunn, for their coverage of the Tiananmen Square democracy movement in China and the massacre that followed. More on Sheryl's amazingly talented trailblazing later. They were the first married couple to win a Pulitzer for journalism. Nick was awarded his second Pulitzer for his coverage of the tragic conflict in Darfur. He is a regular CNN contributor and an op-ed columnist for the New York Times and author of many, many best-selling books. His latest is Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Susan. Delighted to be on with you and Jean.
It's awesome to have you on. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. I think you have one of the largest comfort zones of anyone I've ever met. I see a lot of parallels between you and what I read in your recent book, Chasing Hope, about your father's story, navigating foreign countries, relying on the kindness of strangers in times of chaos and crisis, and relating to people when you often don't even speak the same language. Can you talk to us about your ability to get out of your comfort zone, large as it may be, to research a situation?
Sure. And I mean, I should push back the question a little bit in that I don't know that I'm terribly comfortable at a lot of the places I go. I do spend a lot of the time in the field, kind of petrified. And so I'm not sure that my comfort zone actually is all that large. But I go out. I think it's maybe is in some degree a legacy of my dad. My dad was a World War II refugee. His family, they were Armenians. They had spied on the Nazis during World War II. They got caught. They fled in every which direction. And the family in Portland, Oregon sponsored my dad as a refugee in 1952. And that transformed the Kristof family. Knowing the lessons of that, knowing that people were able to save his life, transform his life, I think, did build in me a sense of the importance of covering humanitarian crises. And you asked about, about getting out in the field and getting out of one's comfort zone. And I think one thing that often people don't really appreciate is that indeed the biggest challenge is getting to the scene. And these days, there's a lot of journalism where people, sit in front of a camera and pontificate. And I'm a deep believer that it's really important to get out and kick tires and interview people in the field. And that's that's expensive. It's hard. I'm lucky that the New York Times is willing to let me spend its money on these things. And often regimes don't really want you to go and report on genocides they're committing. For example, when I was covering the Darfur genocide, Sudan, wouldn't give me a visa. I periodically just crossed the border illegally. Once the Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, was making a brief visit to Darfur. I think it was 2 hours on his a stopover on his way to Kenya. And he let me come on the plane. And then as we were coming down for his brief stopover, I went back to him and said, look, I just want you to know that I'm going to be missing the plane out. And I don't want anybody to worry if I miss the plane out. And so sure enough, that's what I did. I missed the plane out. And there I was in the back of the crowd watching that plane take off. And I was so exhilarated because here I was in the heart of this genocide. And the Sudanese authorities did not know that I was there and could not shadow me and follow me. And I was able to report on it with a caveat that I quickly realized there were checkpoints all over. And, I didn't have a pass to get through the checkpoints. But then I saw that these UN workers were just waving their English language passes and being waved through. And I realized that, these soldiers at the checkpoint, they probably couldn't read Arabic, let alone English. And so I pulled out my United Airlines mileage plus card and got to the checkpoint and waved it. And you wouldn't believe the respect that even people have, who are busy committing genocide have for United Airlines mileage plus programs. So that got me through.
That's quite a story.
The New York staff writer and CNN senior analyst Jeffrey Toobin is quoted in the Harvard Crimson. Now, he was a colleague of yours at Harvard, was quoted as saying, "I'm not surprised to see Nick emerge as the moral conscience of our generation of journalists. I am surprised to see him as the Indiana Jones of our generation of journalists." And I'd like to add just a little bit to that. I see you also as a little bit of a Don Quixote, not in the sense of tilting at impossible windmills, but in the real sense of that book is that in Don Quixote, the real sense is every human being counts. And that's how I see you as a Don Quixote. Every human being counts to you. And you say that journalism shouldn't be cynical, that its fuel is a sense of mission. Could you talk to us about making the effable the ineffable and something about purpose-driven journalism?
Yeah, and thanks for the Don Quixote reference. I do have to confess that I do spend a fair amount of my time tilting at windmills, but that's partly on the theory that if you tilted enough windmills, occasionally you hit one. And so in terms of purpose-driven journalism, it's I get outraged by things that I see, and I want to fight back. I want to see what I can do to create a better world. And my tools to fight dictators or genocide are a laptop and a camera. And that does invest me. I mean, that's why I leave my comfort zone and go to Darfur or raid a brothel or whatever it may be. And, one of the first things that really left me with that strong sense was when I was the New York Times Beijing bureau chief in 1989 and was covering the Tiananmen democracy movement and was on Tiananmen Square on that terrible night of June 3rd to 4th, 1989. And the People's Liberation Army sent in thousands of troops and mowed down pro-democracy protesters, including the people in the crowd that I was in. And you can't watch a modern army slaughter its citizens and just not feel that this is something you want to fight back at. And I think, in that case, it was particularly motivated because, frankly, I felt a certain amount of guilt that in covering the democracy movement, I had periodically wrote with a certain amount of condescension about some of the peasants and workers who were part of that democracy movement that, they say that they're for democracy, but they can't really define the democracy that they're for. And there was some truth to that. But that terrible night when I was cowering, the bravest people were these uneducated rickshaw drivers. And they were, whenever there was a lull in the firing, they would pedal out with their rickshaws and pick up the bodies of kids who'd been killed or injured and then rush them to the hospitals. And I wasn't doing that. And there was a bus driver, an uneducated, salt of the earth bus driver that night, who saw the trucks of soldiers coming in to massacre the students. And he quickly parked his bus across the road to block the trucks. And he turned the engine off and got out. And it was night. And an officer got out of the lead truck and ordered him to move the bus. And the bus driver said no. And the officer pointed his sidearm at the bus driver and said, "Move the bus." And at that, this bus driver took the keys in his hand and just hurled them into the high grass beside the road. You know, maybe he couldn't define democracy. He was willing to die for it. And I have thought in recent years that we in the US could learn a lot from people like that I saw that night about the importance of democracy, about valuing the democracy that we inherited, but haven't always been willing to fight to preserve. And, that invests me with a sense of purpose.
And you say in your book that what matters to me increasingly wasn't prizes, but purposes. You've won many prizes, and an amazing number of prizes, but it's the purpose. And is this what caused you to write the 5 books with your wife, Sheryl WuDunn, that focus on human rights and social justice?
Yeah. There were a couple of things going on that led us to write the books. One was increasingly seeing the gender dimension of oppression and trafficking. I wrote back in the late 90s what I thought was going to be one article about young girls being trafficked, and then I was visited a brothel in Cambodia, and there were these young girls, 13 years old, 12 years old, who'd been kidnapped from their villages and were being sold for their virginity, auctioned off for their virginity. And I just could not believe this was happening. This felt like 19th century slavery, except these girls were being dead of AIDS by their 20s. And it just, then that led me to report more on trafficking, on inequities, on sexual violence, on domestic violence, on the lack of opportunities for education for girls in many countries around the world. And so that led, Sheryl and me, and Sheryl is a great tutor on these issues as well for me, to write the book Half the Sky, and to try to spread the word, to evangelize on this cause that we deeply believed in, about the importance of empowering women and girls around the world. And another, as I was seeing these humanitarian crises and reporting on these humanitarian crises in other countries, I was coming back home to the family farm where I'm right now, in rural Oregon, and seeing a humanitarian crisis right here among kids that I grew up with. This is a farming area. It had been dependent on timber, agriculture, and light manufacturing. Those jobs went away. Meth arrived, and a lot of people got in deep trouble. At this point, more than a third of the kids on my old grade school and high school bus have died from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. Many of them not only suffered a great deal, they also inflicted great suffering on others. And it felt as if we as a nation had not come to terms with that, had not done nearly enough to try to help folks who'd been left behind. And again, we thought that a tool to try to raise this issue, elevate it on the agenda, was a book. And so that's what we've been doing. One of my most powerful memories from childhood is the number 6 school bus. But this memory is also tinged with sadness, because today about a quarter of the kids who rode that bus with me are no longer alive.
Honestly, it just sucks, man. I had everything I wanted in my early 20s. I have nothing now.
We can get prostitutes, we can get drugs. This is no place for a child to be, even an adult.
I mean, I heard he sort of blew himself up making math.
Yeah. Left a big hole in the world, left in my heart, too.
I'm Nicholas Kristof. My wife, Sheryl, and I have worked together for decades covering some of the greatest injustices of our time.
Nicholas Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn. Their coverage won them a Pulitzer Prize.
But we've become increasingly shocked by what's been taking place here in America.
Now, Nick and I are traveling across the country into the heart of communities battling despair.
America is unique when it comes to inequality. We are the richest country on the planet with the worst poverty. That's who we are.
My wife said, "Please call me." That's all she wrote. That text message, I knew my brother was dead.
You're taught that anyone who used these drugs are evil people. You're not given any indication that these are people who are dealing with health issues.
We're in the worst affordable housing crisis in years, maybe decades.
So 4 families living in a single wide.
Yes.
We want to understand how so many people fell through the cracks and what can be done to change things.
I'm not rich. I have 2 roommates. I don't own my house. I barely own a running car. But there needs to be people that are willing to say, hey, let me help you.
I think it takes a village for someone to succeed. If it wasn't for the support, I don't think I would have just done it.
Whether or not there will be opportunity for everyone, that's the question that we're facing right now as a nation.
So it's time for a new version of the American dream. One that includes everybody.
Speaking of books, we like to have authors read a selection. Would you read a short selection to us from your new memoir, Chasing Hope?
I'd be flattered. Let me find my glasses here since I'm going blind in my old age. This is about, this question of hope. It's not obvious that I'd be writing about hope, but here we go. The hope that I have built up over a career covering war and dictatorship, genocide and poverty spurs me on. This isn't a naive optimism, but one modulated by seeing how much can go wrong and how horrific the consequences are when events tumble out of control. This is a scarred hope, an echo of Mandela's or Tutu's, one that acknowledges human frailty and also believes in self-efficacy and in our capacity to right wrongs and fix problems. It's a hope nurtured by seeing the defeat of apartheid and Jim Crow and the decline of illiteracy and extreme poverty, by celebrating the gains from environmental protection, civil rights movements, and the empowerment of women. It's a hope that is the opposite of complacency or resignation, but instead spurs action and can be self-fulfilling if we first recognize and confront the challenges squarely. And that's where journalists come in.
That's a great passage. In fact, it speaks exactly to what I was getting ready to ask you, was the title of your book, Chasing Hope, that I thought was such an amazing title based on the fact of what you've seen, massacre at Tiananmen Square, genocide in Darfur, the sex trafficking, all of that. Can you, and speaking about what's going on in Oregon and many, many, many other communities like what you've experienced in your hometown, what is it that you and Sheryl are looking for when you write these books? And in your hopeful way, as a hopeful journalist, have you experienced reactions from your books that continue to give you hope? Are you seeing that people read your books and you see a result of that?
Absolutely. And, as authors, we want not just to be read, but we want to empower people to feel hope and then feel that sense of agency and then go do things. And we have seen that, maybe especially with Half the Sky. We've always encouraged, a lot of book clubs read our books and then we're hoping that when they put the book down, they won't just put it down and move on to the next book, but that they will then see if they can raise money for a good cause, or, for the holidays, maybe jointly choose one charity and donate to it, things like that. And I mean, I think the reason I focus so much on hope is that, especially maybe among young people in the US, there is this real miasma of despair. And the challenges are real. Look, there's climate change and threats to democracy, and people fear they aren't going to be able to buy a home. And I mean, the challenges are very real. But what I've also seen is that where there is a measured, balanced hope, that increases our ability collectively to overcome these challenges around us. And I don't think a lot of people appreciate that the fundamental change in our lifetimes has been astonishing progress against disease, against poverty, against illiteracy, against child death. When I was born, one child out of 5 worldwide died before the age of 5. Now we're down to 3%, and it's lower level pretty much every year. And I think that what people don't always appreciate, and what we've tried to convey, is that side by side with the worst of humanity, you invariably encounter the very best. And for example, we've written about in rural Pakistan a woman named Mukhtar Mai, who was sentenced by a village council to be gang raped because of an offense that her younger brother supposedly had committed. And then the village council carried out that sentence. They gang raped her, and they expected that she would then kill herself out of shame. But instead, Mukhtar Mai somehow found the courage to report the rape, to send her attackers to prison, and then to use compensation money to start the first school in her village, and to enroll not only girls, but also to enroll the children of her attackers. You just can't be in that village and see these kids attending that school and learning to read for the first time. And, among those kids in their little shiny uniforms are the kids of her rapists. And you just can't be there and just not feel that we humans are an amazing species. And when we manage to overcome all the burdens around us, we are capable of extraordinary things.
Well, that does give you hope. What a story.
Absolutely.
Nick, you and I have something very much in common. We both love words. You mentioned in your book that a friend at Oxford, you would each call each other logophiles and challenge each other with words. Now, how do you control that in your writing? Because your books are so approachable. So even though you love words and probably could load the book with long words that I'd have to look up in my dictionary, how do you control that and still keep your love of words?
Well, partly my love for my wife overcomes my love for words, because Cheryl's a very good editor, and she slaps me down when I try to throw in too much kind of boring stuff, either fancy words that are a little unnecessary, or research studies, which I also have a great fondness for. And Cheryl has a great sense of the importance of pacing and keeping readers going. But I find purpose in the subjects that I write about, but also in the beauty of writing. I mean, writing is something aesthetic. At its best, it's a little like painting a piece of art or composing a piece of music. There is a beauty in words and conjuring scenes and inviting readers to view that. And so I don't apologize too much for the logophilia.
Okay. Along those lines, you write both columns and lengthy books. Columns, you are controlled in the number of words that you may use. How do you mentally cope with this in your writing? Do you just set out, I'm writing a column, keep it down, or we like to focus a lot on writing because people love to know about the writing process. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between writing a column and writing a book?
When Sheryl and I first did a book about China, we we thought it was going to be like writing a long article. And then we realized in the course of it that no, we had to go back and re-report, because when I'm interviewing somebody for an article or a column, I make sure I have their name spelled right. I get their age, maybe the city they're from, and that's about it. When you have a character in a book, ideally you want that person to be a recurring character, a thread throughout the book, part of a narrative process, and you need to go back and figure out what that person's grandfather or grandmother were like. You need to have a much deeper sense of what shapes them, how they, their background and where they're going, the issues that they're wrestling with. Whereas, in a column, I'm looking for a quote. And so it really is, I think, quite different. And I think often people who haven't done books don't appreciate the importance of that narrative arc, so that the first chapter and the last chapter are talking to each other and everything in between. My book begins with hope, it ends with hope. Hope is a narrative thread throughout the massacres, the brothels, and all the rest. And that took a while to learn.
Well, personally, I absolutely love the genre of, say, a Tolkien, where, you have this good versus evil battle, and good overcomes, and the belittled rise above the oppressors, and goodness prevails. And I see you writing that well, that you write what's really happening. Did you ever consider writing a book of fiction along those lines?
So I would love to write good fiction. I must say that when I read fiction, it's sometimes it's literary fiction, but often it's also just escapist fiction. It's kind of beach fiction. It's thrillers, that kind of thing. Just something just to get my mind away from the work. And so I have tried to write a thriller, and boy, it's just so much harder than it looks. You see some cheap novel and you think, oh, it's all plot. You don't need to worry about character. But actually, when you get down to it, then figuring out the pacing and everything, it's a lot harder than it looks. We were talking to John McPhee, who was Sheryl's old professor, about this, and he's one of the most amazing writers of the last 100 years. And, he was saying the same thing, that he it's a skill set that he just doesn't have, that ability to write, a beach thriller. And so I'm jealous of these people who just churn them out every 6 months, and it's all plot driven, and it's an amazing skill that I don't think I have.
Well, it's nice to see you shine in what you do. That's important.
In a talk you gave recently at the Dallas Museum of Art, which I had the pleasure of attending, you said that there's an unwritten code for journalists. And then you said that on 2 occasions you broke it and you're completely comfortable with that. Could you talk about those occasions?
Yeah, I think that the most important was probably when Sheryl and I were covering the Tiananmen democracy movement, the massacre afterward. There was a young man named Liu Xiang, who was a university student who had helped us cover the democracy movement, partly because he had helped us. He was imprisoned. He escaped from prison. And then he came to Beijing and asked us for help fleeing the country. One pretty basic rule of being a foreign correspondent is you don't help an escaped felon flee the country. And yet here's a 19-year-old kid who had been imprisoned already because he had helped us and help New York Times readers. And if we didn't help him, at some point he was going to get caught and terrible things would have happened to him. And so we agonized over our responsibilities to obey Chinese law, to not get the New York Times in trouble, to not get ourselves in trouble. If we'd been caught helping him, it certainly would have been bad for us. The New York Times Bureau probably would have been shut down. And yet, again, it comes down to this 19-year-old kid. And in the end, and we were also, frankly, a little wondering, we'd never heard of anybody escaping from a Chinese prison before. I mean, was this real, or was this some kind of effort to entrap us? And we, I think it was the most difficult ethical decision I've ever had to make. In the end, we did help him. We write about that in Chasing Hope. He was able to get to Hong Kong. We flew to Hong Kong the next day, helped him get to the US. He's now an American. And it was probably the least professional thing I ever did, but maybe the one that I'm proudest of. And I forget what the other, there are a few candidates. I forget what the other one I mentioned in that.
We were talking about buying one of those children who was.
2 girls, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it was 2004, I had been writing a lot about human trafficking. It was so hard to get people's attention. And I think they just thought, oh, these prostitutes in some distant land, too bad. And so I ended up in a little village in Cambodia, buying 2 young girls from their brothels. I got written receipts for buying them. I paid $250 for one and just over $300 for the other. I got written receipts. And when you get a written receipt for buying a human being in this century, it just feels so profoundly wrong. Then took them back to their families. And in one case, the family thought their daughter had died, and it was, journalists are supposed to be watching from the sidelines. And that was the case where I, bounded into the arena, as a vehicle to write about this and call more attention to it. And again, I think it helped raise attention to the issue. And ultimately, the U.S. put more pressure on the Cambodian government to close down these brothels and to close down trafficking. Didn't solve the problem, but it sure improved it.
Bravo.
You're talking about bounding into the arena gives us back again, both Indiana Jones and Don Quixote. In this.
Yes.
I can't imagine receiving a receipt for another human being. Oh my goodness. Does that really shine the light on what you all were talking about? Thank you so very much for joining us for this conversation. I know that you are a tremendously busy man doing things that obviously are quite important. And it's an honor to have spoken with you. And we just thank you so much for joining us.
It's been great to be with you and Jean. In our conversation, we solved many of the world's problems.
Yeah. When I told people that I had met you at the DMA, I came back saying, he said yes. He said yes to us. He's going to do an interview with us. We thank you so very much.
Nick, you've written 5 best-selling books with your wife, Sheryl WuDunn. And Sheryl is a woman of many accomplishments and several notable firsts. The first Asian American reporter to win a Pulitzer Prize, the first Chinese American reporter at the New York Times, where she worked as a foreign correspondent in Tokyo. Sheryl is also a business executive and an entrepreneur, along with being a best-selling author. Newsweek named her one of the 150 women who shake the world. Wow.
I married up.
Oh my gosh, you did well. PBS said she's one of the leading women who make America, and Harvard Business School named her one of the most eminent graduates. So We are very, very pleased to welcome Sheryl to our conversation. Hello, Sheryl.
Hello, thank you so much.
We're honored to have you here.
In your book, Half the Sky, you and Nick sent a clear message that throughout most of the world, the greatest unexploited economic resource is the female half of the population. That's a clear message that ending the oppression of women will help to benefit all the world's inhabitants. Would you speak to that?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I think one of the best quotes that sums up that statement is something that happened when Bill Gates was in Saudi Arabia years ago. And it was a conference of men and women. The men were on one side and the women were on the other side. So they were not integrated. And someone on the men's side stood up and said, "Mr. Gates, we would in Saudi Arabia like to become one of the top 10 economies in the world. How can we do that?" And his reply was, "You have to start employing the other half of your population. Otherwise, there's no way you will ever get to be in the top 10 of the economies." So very pragmatically, women are half the population, half the workforce. And when you look at demographics in the rest of the world, for instance, when we talk about China, we talk about India's economy, we're looking at demographics, the young people, men and women, boys and girls, who can become the engine of the economy. Without, half of the population, that engine starts sputtering over time. There are many other reasons. It's not just gender. There's age, and that's why China's economy, for instance, is beginning to slow. The peak, work rate of the number of people who are working age population has already passed us. And now people are looking to India to become, at some point, the largest economy in the world because of its demographics and its rising population numbers. That's the pragmatic, the sort of numbers part of that, of the answer to your question. The other part is more qualitative. So the idea of an open economy is extremely important. An open economy is not just open to ideas, but it's also open to new ways of thinking and also open to women. So that is one gauge, whether an economy employs women, of whether or not economy will survive, will thrive, will be able to rejuvenate itself when the business cycle turns sour. And that's why we look at certain economies. If they're rigid, maybe also because they're rigid in terms of opening their economy to women. The other part is that women, they're more educated. In the family, they tend to focus on education and health of their kids. So the more that you have an educated woman, the better she can educate her kids and take care of the health and well-being of her kids. And there is so much underappreciated hidden talent among women. So I want to give you the example of Tererai Trent. She was in Zimbabwe. She was always a very good student at school. Her brother, who was younger than her, was never really that good, but he was the one who the family wanted to pay to go to school for. And so she had to drop out because they couldn't afford the school fees, but he would come bring his homework home, and then she would secretly do his homework because he hated school and she loved learning and she couldn't learn on her own. So she would do his homework and he would bring it in, he'd do really well. But then at age 11, she was married off at 11. And then she ended up having 5 kids. Her husband obviously didn't want her to go to school, didn't want her to work, just wanted her to take care of the kids. Then Joy Luck from Heifer International happened to be in the village, and a bunch of women gathered around, and Joy was saying, you have dreams. Write down your dreams. Because those will be your goals, and you should pursue your goals. You have every right to pursue your goals. So Tererai Trent took a piece of paper and wrote down 3 goals. She said, I want to get a bachelor's degree. I want to get a college degree. Crazy for a woman who hadn't even gone to elementary, right? Then her next goal was, I want to get a master's degree. And then her third goal was, I want to get a PhD. So she took this list of goals and buried it under a rock. Soon she was doing correspondence course, and she started learning really well, doing excellently. And then she got her correspondence bachelor's degree. So she dug up that little piece of paper. It was in a tin can. She crossed off goal number 1. And then, because she did so well in a correspondence school, she applied for colleges in the US and got a scholarship to attend on scholarship a university in the US. She was in the US, she, brought her 5 kids, and she did so well. She got her master's degree, went back to Zimbabwe, dug up that tin can, crossed off goal number 2. And then she went back and she said, I'm going to get my PhD. She did so well. She got her PhD, went back to the village, dug out that tin can, and crossed off goal number 3. So here's an example of how underappreciated and oppressed women are. But if you give them the opportunity, look how they can shine.
Wow. I need to get out a tin can. That's an awesome story. I love that. That's incredible. With your book, A Path Appears, Transforming Lives, Creating Opportunities, it profiles individuals and institutions that are working to make the world a better place. And it shows us how we can do the same. And I find that an extremely interesting concept. There was a 3-part series on PBS. So how do we as individuals increase opportunity for people who are born below the starting line?
Right. There are many things that we can do, and we actually underappreciate our capacity as well, our potential. First of all, every one of us has a social media, Facebook, whatever, Twitter. And so we actually can expand our reach beyond our physical, ability. We don't all go to church anymore, but we do belong to communities. And it's increasingly important for us to try to build and belong to communities, because we don't have that church-going habit that basically was prevalent 100 years ago. We are trying to do that with Kristof Farms, for instance. People can join our wine club. And then because of that, we create a virtual community conversation with our club community, because we realize that people want to belong. They want to find people who they can talk with and have discussions with. So we have a book club, and that's a very helpful way to work with friends. So after Half the Sky and A Path Appears came out, people formed book clubs, and they were reading the book. And we have a list of organizations in the back of the books, and based on topics, they can say, oh, well, we're all interested in education. So they get together and they say, okay, well, let's choose something that we want to do in education. We want to help, tutor, or we want to help kids learn how to read. So they find an organization they can work with together, and they get involved. And when you do it with friends, it's a much more pleasurable way of contributing, to helping other people. And so I do think that it's a way that each one of us can play a role. I think it's also important that it's not just that, you're going to help someone else, and that really is going to help that other person. Helping people is a lot harder than you think. So there's also, something important is that there is a self-interest involved there too. If you were to be given a drug, or if there were a drug that will allow you to be happier, to be a better person, and to live longer with no side effects, would you take it?
Yes.
Well, what is that drug? It turns out that the brain has pleasure centers, like the nucleus accumbens, that are activated by things like food, flirting, laughter, sex. They are also activated when you give or you help someone else. So in fact, research shows that there are several ways of reducing your overall risk of mortality in any given year. So yes, some people still go to church regularly, and going to church actually reduces that risk by about 29%. That's great risk, right? Because of the community, the sense of community. There's also a way you can reduce that risk by exercising 4 times or more a week. And lots of people are exercising. There's a craze, right? And exercising 4 times or more a week reduces your risk of mortality in any given year by 30%. But volunteering for 2 or more organizations reduces your risk of mortality by a whopping 44%. So now if you volunteer for a religious running organization, well, maybe you'll be a little immortal. The point is that that drug is giving, it's compassion, and it's volunteering and helping others.
Wow. I have to give you a little example of how your work goes out on and out. I heard you speak at the Mayborn Conference here at the University of North Texas several years ago when your book, Half the Sky, came out. And I brought my son with me, and he's a high school teacher, works with IB students. And he was so motivated from your talk that he went to his students and proposed that they devise a way to raise money to give to the Heifer International from hearing you speak. So you touched me and my son. My son went on and touched all those children in his class, and who knows how many they have touched. So it's a wonderful example of the explosion that can happen by someone like you creating these books. You and Nick have written 5 excellent books, and being a writer, and to me, it's a lonely process. I am a writer myself, and not like you, but I have written a couple of books. And how do you co-author a book? Do you and Nick divide up your process? Do you share your ideas together? And how do you find time to do the incredible research that's in your book? Because if you look at the back matter in your book, you aren't writing off the top of your head. You are basing your ideas on what other people have done and then sharing that work and adding your own into it.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Jean. That was really wonderful to hear about you and your son. So I appreciate that. Second of all, we stand on the shoulders of all the wonderful research that has come before us. And we are really drawing upon the amazing research that has been thrown out into the world. I mean, there's been a revolution in data gathering, and researchers at universities like yours, in these topics. And so we benefit from all of that. And so because of the internet, we are able to do enormous amount of research in much shorter time frame than if this were happening 30, 40 years ago, right? So that's extremely important. And in terms of the way Nick and I work together, basically, we have to conceive of the book beforehand. You sort of plot out and map out the book, and then we take different topics based on, where our background is in and what we're interested in, where we think the trajectory is in that particular chapter. And then, so we each have our own little areas of the book.
Wonderful. And it all comes together. What I like is it's seamless. You work it so that it isn't, okay, I can tell she wrote this chapter and he wrote that chapter. Your process in your 5 books really becomes quite seamless.
Yes, no, thank you. No, we're, I think that we both sort of very familiar with the New York Times voice.
Well, hope and opportunity have definitely been a theme throughout this whole conversation. What an incredibly fantastic theme to have. All of your books focus on conditions around the world that result in a lot of suffering and deprivation. And interestingly enough, you and Nick not only focus on the despair, but also, as we've said, addressing the opportunities that come from empowering people. And that's quite a message. There's optimism emanating from both of you that's evident even in the titles of your books. Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. Half the Sky, that comes from the saying that women hold up half the sky. What a beautiful, beautiful expression that is. A Path Appears, Thunder from the East, Portrait of a Rising Asia, and China Wakes, The Struggle for the Soul of a Rising Power. So let's talk about that. What would you say about what I just said?
Well, so we have always tried to pair despair with hope because we're pragmatic and focused on solutions. As journalists, we tend to write or have tended to write mainly about despair because that's what news is, right? A successful school day where children are safe from guns is not new. A school massacre like Appalachia, Georgia is news that is bad. So as journalists, we learned long ago that as writers, if you want to bring about change, you need to offer hope alongside the despair. So, you know, hope seems very squishy, touchy-feely, but there's actually some data that underscores the importance and the power of hope. Esther Duflo is an economist at MIT, and she did research in India. And her focus was on the impact of giving goats and cows to family, kind of what heifer does, right? Just giving a goat, you really can change the trajectory of a family. And we have many stories where, you know, a family has gotten a goat, and then it allows the girls to go to school. But then they started doing a little bit more discriminatory and scrutinizing research to find out exactly how much of an improvement was there. And it turns out that giving a family a goat, if you go back years later, you'll find that they've done much better than just the income that you would imagine that a goat would bring them. And they sort of looked at, oh, what could it be? What could it be? And they determined that it was hope. The family, by getting that goat and seeing how it could change and improve their lives, got more hope. And they saw it opened their eyes. Oh, well, if the goat brings in this money, maybe if we plant some apple trees, or maybe if we plant some plum trees, we can sell the plums, we can sell the vegetables, we can do even better. So it multiplied the impact. It was a multiplier. And what really fueled that multiplication was hope. So we think that hope is much more powerful than just this touchy, you know, squishy feely kind of word that we think of it as, that it really can translate into action.
That's a marvelous idea. It goes so beyond what I can do myself individually, because a person can create a spark, like you say, that spark of hope. So then it leads people to do more and more and realize that there is a brighter outlook. And that's just marvelous. Do you happen to have an excerpt that you would like to read?
Oh, sure. Yes. Okay. So it's from Half the Sky, and I'll read it to you. The tide of history is turning women from beasts of burden and sexual playthings into full-fledged human beings. The economic advantages of empowering women are so vast as to persuade nations to move in that direction. Before long, we will consider sex slavery, honor killings, and acid attacks as unfathomable as foot binding. The question is how long that transformation will take and how many girls will be kidnapped into brothels before it is complete, and whether each of us will be part of that historical movement or a bystander.
Good choice. Good choice. That encapsulates so much of what you've been saying, and it's such an important message.
Sheryl, we couldn't end without asking a little bit about Kristof Farms in Yamhill, Oregon. You talked a little bit about it. Did this come about because of what you described in the problems of the people in your area, and you wrote about them in Tightrope? There also was a video, a documentary about this. Is it the Kristof's way of supporting your economy around your area? Would you talk about that?
Sure. So when we were actually doing research on Tightrope, it just so happens that this farm that Nick grew up on was a cherry orchard. And I guess those cherries, they were pie cherries, not eating cherries. And so they went into, cherry pies. And unfortunately, Americans stopped eating cherry pie, or they were eating less cherry pie. And so the local buyer and manager in the area got out of the business, which meant that we had to get out of the business because we were not going to take that on. So we had to figure out what to plant. And then as we were researching for Tightrope, we realized that, maybe it could be a value added crop, because cherries were not value added. We did not add value. We would just, harvest them and they would be shipped out. A value added crop, and probably the most important value added crop in Oregon, where there's an infrastructure, is wine, grapes for wine. And then the newer was cider apples for cider. A newer industry. So the idea was that, a value added crop would actually help, a tiny, we're just a tiny farm here comparatively. And so we thought, well, at least we can help the local economy. We might be able to employ local people more, because you actually harvest by hand and it's not machine, whereas cherries were harvested by machine. So that's what we thought we could do. And then now we realize building a community is so important. People feel very isolated, especially in the rural area where we are. People are sort of isolated in their homes. And so hopefully if they can feel they can join a community, and wine certainly helps. Wine and cider certainly helps. It sort of relaxes people. And there's, sense of social togetherness that you can create when you're, sipping a glass of wine and talking about conversation that is very interesting to you. So that's the kind of thing that we want to sort of create and build. And we're very excited about it.
I understand your daughter's helping with that project.
She
too.
is, she's she basically she really set up the cider operation and found the our best cider partner to work with, and she did a great job.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so very much, Sheryl. Really cannot thank you enough for joining us. Again, it's just such an honor to speak with someone like you. Jean and I are thrilled to have had you on, and Nick as well. And we just wish you the very, very best in anything you do in the future, because I know it will make a difference. Do you have anything under wraps so that you can talk about?
Right now, we're focusing on Kristof Farms, and we want to build this community. And it's really great to see how people want to just join something. They want to be part of something important, and just also more engaged, and that's what we're seeing. Thank you for having us.
Well, there's that spark that you mentioned earlier, and I'm sure the Kristof family is doing that, sparking the economy and the community around you. So,
well, no, this is also virtual, so people can join from Texas too.
Absolutely, and beyond, Texas and beyond.
We'd be very happy to get people joining from Texas.
Great. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful seeing you again and having this interaction. I know our audience will love it. And I think we'll not just love it, but learn from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean and Susan.